It's classic book talk time. I was coming home from some place at the end of the world about 3 o'clock in the black winter morning, and my way lay through a part of town where there was literally nothing to be seen but lamps. Street after street, all the folks asleep. Street after street, all lighted up as if for a procession, and all as empty as a church, till at last I got into that state of mind where a man listens and listens, and begins to long for the sight of a policeman. All at once I saw two figures, one a little man who was stumping along eastward at a good walk, and another, a girl of maybe 8 or 10, who was running as hard as she was able down a cross street. Well, sir, the two ran into one another naturally enough at the corner, and then came the terrible part of the thing, for the man trampled calmly over the child's body, and left her screaming on the ground. It sounds nothing to hear, but it was hellish to see. It wasn't like a man, it was like a damned juggernaut. I gave a few holler, took to my heels, collared my gentleman, and brought him back to where there was already quite a group around the screaming child. He was perfectly cool and made no resistance, but gave me one look so ugly that it brought out the sweat on me like running. The people who turned out were the girl's own family, and pretty soon the doctor for whom she had been sent put in his appearance. Well, the child was not much the worse, more frightened according to the sawbones, and there you might have supposed would be the end of it. But there was one curious circumstance. I had taken a loathing to my gentleman at first sight. So had the child's family, which was only natural, but the doctor's case was what struck me. He was the usual cut and dry apothecary of no particular age and colour, with a strong Edinburgh accent, and about as emotional as a bagpipe. Well, sir, he was like the rest of us. Every time he looked at my prisoner, I saw that Sawbones turned sick and white with desire to kill him. I knew what was in his mind, just as he knew what was in mine. And killing being out of the question, we did the next best. We told the man we could and would make such a scandal out of this as should make his name stink from one end of London to the other. If he had any friends or any credit, we undertook that he should lose them. And all the time, as we were pitching it in red hot, we were keeping the women off him as best we could, for they were as wild as harpies. I never saw a circle of such hateful faces. And there was the man in the middle, with a kind of black, searing coolness. Frightened, too, I could see that, but carrying it off, sir, really like Satan. If you choose to make capital out of this accident, said he, I'm naturally helpless. No gentleman but wishes to avoid a scene, says he. Name your figure. Well, we screwed him up to £100 for the child's family. He would have clearly liked to stick out, but there was something about the lot of us that meant mischief, and at last he struck. The next thing was to get the money, and where do you think he carried us but to the place with the door, whipped out a key, went in, and presently came back with a matter of £10 in gold, and a cheque for the balance on Coots, drawn payable to bearer, and signed with a name that I can't mention, though it's one of the points of my story, but it's a name at least very well known and often printed. The figure was stiff, but the signature was good for more than that if it was only genuine. I took the liberty of pointing out to my gentleman that the whole business looked apocryphal, and that a man does not, in real life, walk into a cellar door at 4 in the morning and come out with another man's cheque for close upon £100. But he was quite easy in steering. Set your mind at rest, said he. I will stay with you till the bank's open and cash the cheque myself. So we all set off, the doctor and the child's father and our friend and myself, and passed the rest of the night in my chambers, and next day, when we had breakfast, went in a body to the bank. I gave in the cheque myself, and I said I had every reason to believe it was a forgery. Not a bit of it. The cheque was genuine. Tut, tut, said Mr. Utterson. I see you feel as I do, said Mr. Enfield. Yes, it's a bad story, for my man was a fellow that nobody could have to do with, a real damnable man, and the person that drew the cheque is the very pink of the proprieties, celebrated too, and what makes it worse, one of your fellows who do what they call good. Blackmail, I suppose, an honest man paying through the nose for some of the capers of his youth. Blackmail House is what I call the place with the door, in consequence, though even that, you know, is far from explaining it all, he added, and with the words fell into a vein of musing. From this he was recalled by Mr. Utterson, asking rather suddenly, And you don't know if the drawer of the cheque lives there? A likely place, isn't it? Returned Mr. Enfield, but I happen to have noticed his address. He lives in some square or other. And you never asked about the place with the door? Said Mr. Utterson. No, sir. I had a delicacy, was the reply. I feel very strongly about putting questions. It partakes too much of the style of the Day of Judgment. You start a question, and it's like starting a stone. You sit quietly on top of a hill, and away the stone goes. Starting others, and presently some bland old bird, the last you would have thought of, is knocked on the head in his own back garden, and the family have to change their name. No, sir, I make it a rule of mine, the more it looks like Queer Street, the less I ask. A very good rule, too, said the lawyer. But I have studied the place for myself, continued Mr. Enfield. It seems scarcely a house. There is no other door, and nobody goes in or out of that one but once in a great while the gentleman of my adventure. There are 3 windows looking on the court on the first floor, none below. The windows are always shut, but they're clean. And then there's a chimney which is generally smoking, so somebody must live there. And yet it's not so sure, for the buildings are so packed together about the court that it's hard to say where one ends and another begins. The pair walked on again for a while in silence, and then, Enfield, said Mr. Utterson, that's a good rule of yours. Yes, I think it is, returned Mr. Enfield. But for all that, continued the lawyer, there's one point I want to ask. I want to ask the name of that man who walked over the child. Well, said Mr. Enfield, I can't see what harm it would do. It was a man of the name of Hyde. And that is a selection from The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. This book is about kind of good and evil. I don't think I'm giving very much away by saying it's within the same person. Basically, people can be both. Even some of the descriptions of the people that we just heard talking are sort of duplicitous. They have like dual characteristics, like kind of oxymoronic type of things, so that they don't go together. I think that's all intentional. It's a fairly short story in some ways, but it is laden with kind of like hidden meanings in some ways. It's a story like about perhaps like the dangers of repression, the dangers of science. Again, we've got coming back to that theme again. It's essentially a monster story, and it's a theme among a lot of those type of stories. It's a digital book club selection, which means that we have an ebook with simultaneous use. So you could totally use this as a book club book, like a digital book club. And it's going to, shortly after this video, have a guide in it, like I've been doing. So if it sounds interesting, like to kind of be reading about something that's maybe a little more layered, it's got lots of layers in it. You could honestly like pick apart each sentence sometimes. It's pretty easy reading in some ways. Like there's some high vocabulary, but it's mostly pretty easy reading besides the high vocabulary. So, but it's like laden with meaning. So yeah, you can like dig deeper on practically any sentence in here. And like maybe find some like bits and pieces of some sort of foreshadowing or some sort of like an atmosphere that the author's trying to portray. I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea of like what it is about, and I hope you give it a chance.